I heard people like when they wake up in the morning, they look all strung out. It's like they won't recognize you. So.
All right. Well, let's. It sounded like most of you are at least close to or in the editing notes area already, right? And we started talking about this a little bit last time, but we didn't really dive into the code for editing notes. So are there, I mean, there was a lot in this chapter. There's a lot of new material, a lot of new stuff that was added. So far, what parts have been like the most challenging aspects of this chapter for people who've made it there?
Like the control section.
Yeah.
On blur, on key press.
Okay. Yeah, right down near the end for the edit. Yeah, we'll talk about the on blur and on key press. That's a good one too, because that is not React dependent. So I'll be able to show, you know, some of that without React or whatever. We'll just add some stuff to our DOM and manipulate some of it directly. Any other areas that have been particularly challenging or? Nothing else that people? Yours isn't running? All right. Do you know any idea what's wrong?
It keeps saying you're going to have nodes because it's such file process that's it. So 1.7.
All right.
You're missing it.
Yeah, and try to like add something in there instead that file exists or something.
Huh. All right. We'll try and, I mean, if somebody wants to work through that, they can. Otherwise, we'll definitely spend some time, you know, at the end of class to try and work through that more. Anybody else? Anything they've been stuck on or particularly challenging in this chapter so far? Just confusing? I mean, there is, like I said, there is a lot that's been added. So I think one good thing to start with that sort of got added here, and I can't remember if we've talked about this before at all, is this sort of ... variable name syntax. Have we sort of discussed that at all and what that's doing? Yeah, because he uses it elsewhere in the code to show like, because let's find a good example, right? Hold on. Where do we go? Like right here, right? ... means I'm not showing you everything. Yeah, that's a little confusing. So this is, I mean, this isn't that hard once you get used to it, but it's a little bit of a new concept, and it's a pattern from, I can't remember if it's been standardized in the newest JavaScript versions yet, or if it's still being worked on. But basically what it will do, and I think the best way to show this is to just, let's go ahead and pull up our JavaScript console and sort of look at what's going on. And I think it's supported here. We'll see if it supports all of this. But if we created, you want to create a different type of object than we've been doing before? Any ideas for a different category of object than a hero? No? What?
Don't you just do like we did in JavaScript and just build an object?
Yeah, I know. I was just wondering if anybody had any creative ideas for an object to make. I always just make a hero.
Thanksgiving dinner.
Dinner. Okay. We're going to make a dinner object. So we have a dinner object. what are some properties of our dinner object? We have an appetizer.
Yeah, courses.
Yeah, let's say courses. How many courses are there? 3 courses.
6.
What? 6. All right.
Welcome to his house.
There's an appetizer, salad.
What's our appetizer here?
Um,
What do we have as our appetizer?
Like this regular dinner.
veggie dip, veggie.
It can be Thanksgiving.
Oh, spinach dip.
Spinach dip. All right. What type of salad do we have at Caesar's?
Yes.
I'm going to regret this because there's no way I'm going to spell this correctly.
Base butter.
Did I spell it wrong? Did I spell it right? I don't know.
I think it's better.
You spelled
It's supposed to be EA.
I'm just going with it. I'm committing to the wrong. All right.
it. It's a,
All right. What else do we have? We have main course. Main course, and oh, guess what? Our main course is an object too. It's going to have some complexity to it, right? So, so what's some item in the main course? I don't know. The side. What's our side dish?
you do side one. You need 2 sides. You gotta have starch and you gotta have veggie.
No, we'll just have that as a veg. We'll call it a starch. All right. What's our starch?
Potatoes, yeah.
Mashed potatoes. All right. All right. What's our vegetable?
Broccoli.
No. That would be mine. I'm trying to eat healthier. So, all right. And then we have our, what are we going to call it? Our protein.
Yep.
Our protein.
Lentils.
Lentils. Oh man. We're not going with the lentils. We had turkey.
Salad.
All right. Are we gonna have some dessert?
Yes.
What's our dessert?
Vanilla cheesecake.
What?
Cheesecake.
Cheesecake? I heard something else. I'm sorry. Cheesecake loses out to ice cream every time. All right. Well, our courses is definitely wrong here, you know. So let's look at our dinner. All right, we have like what? 2, 3, 4, right? So let's just update that to make it accurate. So what we have is an object here, right? And it's got some complexity to it, some different items on it. Nothing too advanced, and I'll feel comfortable with this. We could even maybe we'll add something to our prototype. I don't know. What do we want to call this? Read menu. And it's going to be a function. Oh, read menu, and that's a function that will, so this is part of our object or whatever, right? And all that's really going to do is, I'm going to be extra lazy here. We'll even just do this type of function so I don't have to write something out more complex. And we'll do string literal. This is going to get complex though. So for an appetizer, we have this dot appetizer. Followed by a our main course is I'm gonna regret this if I have some of the syntax wrong, but. That's at property read menu of undefined. Okay, so instead, let me change this a little bit and jump right to the start. I'm just going to add it straight to my dinner. There we go. So I can do dinner.read menu or whatever. Oh, I have something wrong. See? Let me try and change this. See what happens. There we go. All right. It was just because of the arrow function and the way it binds, and that's something you probably don't need to worry about. So now we even added an ability to read out our menu, right? So we got an object with some capability on it. And I'm just doing that sort of for fun, but this, getting back to what we were looking at in editing notes, this sort of ... syntax. We've sort of gotten used to this idea of default values and destructuring, which is that we can destructure some items like our appetizer and dessert straight off of our dinner. Oh, hold on. So now we have direct appetizer and dessert variables, right? What we did is just pulled those out of our object or got the values directly out of there. So our dinner still has them, but we got some variables that directly refer to those using this sort of pattern matching dereferencing syntax. Well, there's also, and I don't know if this is going to work directly in the browser, we're going to find out. There's a capability to do something. I've already declared appetizer. All right, so let's instead, I've already pulled those appetizer and dessert off. Let's get main course and then other courses, I'll call it. And so what this does is it's very similar to what we did before. We pulled off the main course, which is just this object. And our dinner obviously still hasn't changed. It still has everything. But other courses, what that gets is essentially the rest of the object minus the other items that you had pulled off, right? So this is a new object with all of the other properties of our original dinner except main course because we assigned that to a different variable. So it's, if we go and relate that to what we have here in this notes line here, this is a line saying, all right, we're passing in some object as our argument. And what we want to do is get the children property of that object and assign it to a children variable. And then everything else from that object assigned to this props variable. So it's sort of a way to like strip something off of our object, if you will, right? We stripped off the children, and now the rest of the prop, we've got a new object with all the other props. And then what it does here, this is, what is this called? It's called spread notation. And what that's doing is sending all of those properties in individually into this div, item by item. So we've done that, a little bit of that already in some of this course, but it's the equivalent of, you know, this, I can't remember what other properties are on there, but let's say we're passing in all the dinner properties, right? Like we just did, and we pulled off the main course. We had this same line here. We got main course and other courses. So then if we were in React and we were writing our code out, ... other courses like that, and this is going to throw an error because this isn't React, but that is the same as if we had written div appetizer equals and salad equals, so it's the same as making every single one of those items an individual property passed into that React component. It's just a very lazy shorthand sort of way of spreading all those out as individual properties.
So once you already have them all down, if you want to call it again, you can do that.
Once you, can you say that again?
Like you already formulated everything, like the courses and everything, and you want to call it again, you use that. Is that what it is? Or no?
I mean, you could. It's essentially, it's a way to, so let's say, and this is what he's sort of doing here, although this isn't as explicit or descriptive, right? So I'm gonna, create a branch here so that I can work in it. So let's say that here in this app or somewhere, let me find a better example. All right, let's say for our note. So on our notes, by the time we're done with this chapter, maybe I need to make this a little larger. Let me make it just a little bit bigger for everyone. The note is getting an on-click property passed into it, but nothing else directly. And then it's getting, this is the children. That becomes the children property because it's defined here. We can talk about that a little bit more. But it has this on-click property that gets passed in. Now let's say that we had some additional properties here. I don't know what, let's just make some up here. I don't want to use type because that's a keyword. Note is done, right? And maybe that's just true. So we're just, we're passing in something extra. And that's because we're going to, at some point, maybe we want to do something if a node is completed, right? I'll say is completed. So we've got essentially three properties that our note component gets. It gets on-click, it gets is completed, and it gets the implicit one that every component gets, which is the children. And children are anything inside of that component where it's being rendered. So in this case, children is an array of two items, editable and button, because those are sort of the children of this note here. So now let's say in our note, let me also get my NPM stuff running. Just make sure I don't break stuff too much here. So at this point, all right, we're passing these items down. And we want our note to be really, really simple, but we want something else to worry about whether it's completed or not. But we still want to act like the note is managing that. So we want our components to be very focused. One of them is just rendering stuff. And another one, is going to be outputting the is completed bit. So one strategy we could use for that would be to create another component here or move this inside note component into another one. So we'll do a const note equals, I'm going to sort of move this up here. And then just because I like to be explicit, I'm going to define this one. I'm going to say it's a completed note. And I'll use a similar syntax here. This is also Let me cheat a little bit, although it won't be exactly the same. It's going to look similar, but what we want to do is, for this completed note bit, all we care about are, we don't even actually care about the children because we're not going to do anything with them. But we do care about is completed. So let's pull that out and then just leave the rest of the props here in this props object to pass through. And now let's change what we do here. So is completed. Well, let's just render a div that will, what it's going to do is have, say, a span in the front. And that's just going to show us whether or not our note is completed. And then it's going to render our note. We want the note to still have all the other properties that it had before. We want it to act the same as it did before, where we were passing in on clicks still, and even the children. Well, all of those are part of this props object. So we can just spread this props object into our note. And, oh, I need to change my export here to export my completed note by default. And assuming stuff didn't blow up horribly, oh, I need to go back up here, get my link. You should. That's weird. I was having to do a path before. I don't know why that suddenly worked. And this one doesn't. Oh, I'll go back. All right, there's something wrong here still. Oh, I think because I'm going to simplify this and just say is completed. That's equivalent to saying that it's true or should be. Let me see here. I might need to convert this to a string to make this render correctly. So that's, I mean, using that same sort of model, that's where that props comes in useful, or the idea of stripping one thing off. So all we did with this completed note, right, is we stripped off one property, the only one we cared about, and we shoved the rest of them into another object. Just said, this other object takes everything else because we don't care about those, and pass those right back down through to the next component because it cares about those, and I don't want to know anything about that, right? So that's another example of using that sort of pattern. And this one in particular is a very common pattern in React development, where you're like, instead of making a complex note component that has to worry about all this, you might add a little bit of extra logic, you know, a layer at a time that wraps stuff. That's, I don't know if that help clarify it by showing another example of it being used or not, but all it's doing is sort of stripping stuff off. So if we went back over here again, and we've got our other courses object, right? And that refers to all these other courses. We can always strip stuff off of that also, you know, by getting another object. We can always get some object that we want, pull off the properties and put the rest in another thing. It's just a little shorthand notation. If we were to write that out in a longer version, it can be done. It's just a little complex to write something out in the longer notation. So it's a powerful little tool, I guess. All right, I'm gonna need to undo all this, I'm sure. Well, I'll just leave it up here for now. So let me see here. That's the first bit that we worked with. Any other, like up here at this top where we're sort of changing how our note works or our notes component? Any big questions about what we're changing with any of that stuff? Anything else there that could use some clarification? No, feeling sort of comfortable with that? I mean, I still haven't gone into the details of what's going on with this bind, and there might be some time to talk about that bit of magic today. Has anybody looked into what this is doing? Try to figure it out? No? I see some head nods a little bit, yeah? Does anybody understand what's going on with it? All right. We may revisit that in a little while. You know, sometimes there's bits of code and it's okay to write code that way. You don't want all of the code that you're writing to sort of be magic where you don't understand exactly what's going on. But it's okay to have pieces of code where you know what to do, but you don't know exactly why that's happening or all of the underlying mechanisms for it. And one of the best things you can do is mark those down and say, oh, I'm going to go investigate that and try and figure it out. So, you know, I think it would be awesome. You know what? In fact, I'm going to do that. I'm not going to explain this bind today, but if anybody wants to take it as a challenge to go and try and look into what this version of using bind is doing and come back and try and explain it, that would be awesome, because that would be a great opportunity for you to dig into something sort of complex. Next class, if not, I'll go over what's going on with that bind mechanism and why it's being written that way. So then we added our editable and our editing stub. And I think I'd have to go back and check. I think this is the first time we've introduced the idea of a component having sort of two different possible render outputs. Is it? Do you know? Where we render one thing in one case and then something else in a different case.
I've seen you do it with like JavaScript.
Right. I love that. So what you want to do is think, this looks no different than an if else return in JavaScript. The only difference is we're returning different components versus returning true or false based off some input. That's really all it is. So this function right here, which is a component that returns different items, is not really functionally different from, you know, if we had is odd, which we've written before, right? Which takes a number and returns odd 2. Is that right? I might have this wrong. Let me see.
You really like modern, don't you?
What?
You really like using modern.
Oh, I wrote that wrong. It's just something you get used to as a programmer. That syntax is a little off. There we go. So let's see if I wrote that right. I mean, it looks right. So functional is no different, and we can write that out as a true if statement using this format instead, and then it'll look the same. So we want to rewrite that. Is odd equals a function that takes a number, and if number mod 2 is equal to 0, then we return false. Else return true. Tell me. There we go. And it works the same. And so it's really useful when you're looking at code to learn to see these patterns and not get hung up on the syntax that's going to throw you off. So if we look at this bit right here, this is doing the same thing. If editing, return one value, and this doesn't have the else because you'll always continue on if an if isn't true. So you can think of this as sort of a implicit else here. Else, return another value of some kind. Oh, that other value is this whole thing.
Kind of like a new colon. You just know it's
Yeah, I mean the else, yeah. So it's really useful to be able to look at code and do sort of exactly what she said, where I was like, oh, we haven't seen this as a React component. She goes, no, but we did that in JavaScript already, you know, and if else returning stuff differently. Exactly, it's the same pattern. And so being able to see it that way will really help you out when you're digging into code, because you won't get hung up on small syntax differences. All right. Let me see here. Then we had connecting the editable note. And this is where it really sort of sped up and just a whole bunch of code was all thrown together in one place. Are there any big questions people had around this area? Not sure. So let me ask you this. When we went through sort of the first bit of code that we were writing in this book, where Key writes it really dense, right? There's a whole bunch going on here. How many people found it really useful when we broke it down and rewrote it sort of line by line using a different syntax? Yeah? All right. So I'm going, I mean, I don't know if I'll be able to do that with everything, but if there's any specific bit here that you're like, man, that's so dense, I can't understand a lot of the stuff going on there, call it out, and I'll try and at least, you know, one section per class or something like that, break it down to help you visualize it easier. Yeah? You have?
I'll sum up the rewriting on the 5 low.
Oh, this?
You gotta make it chunky.
Yeah, so this is, can't really, let me see here. You couldn't really rewrite this to make it chunkier necessarily.
So they just took it out. I was trying to figure out,
N-
maybe deleting it and like, I guess redoing it, or
No.
maybe just deleting it. Or
What do you mean?
like in the heading part, they just take out the line.
Where is, oh, up here or down here?
Well, right there.
So yeah, I mean, all he's doing here is, you know, rewriting it a little bit, and the behavior didn't change. But if we were to, that gets into a little bit of what's going on with that, the bind notation. So let me see here. I think if I were to try and rewrite this, right now, it might be more confusing. I could do it to try and rewrite it for you guys. But it might be a little bit confusing because sort of what's actually doing is, if you will, if you'll bear with me for a moment, you guys can tell me if this was just more confusing or not, is let's replace this on delete.bind. Instead, let's sort of do what this is doing manually. And what this is doing is, yeah, well, I want somebody else to look into it a little bit more, but it's setting this ID as one of the parameters passed into onDelete as the first parameter, essentially. So yeah, again, I think on that, like I said, if I mean, I would love it if somebody digs into this and tries to come here and explain it so it's somebody else.
I'll reword it. What's the null property? I guess
What's the null? Yeah, that's the part that's the most confusing aspect of this. Well, I mean, the other part is also complex, but the null one is really, really confusing. And that's because, this might get a little confusing, but it is sort of important to know when you're working in JavaScript. JavaScript is this dynamic language, and what bind is typically doing is telling it what this object is when you're referring to this. So let's go back to our dinner that we have over here. It's still sitting here, right? And we have a dinner.mainCourse method that we can call. Oops. Oh wait, sorry. Dinner.readMenu, right? With the method, and that spits out information about our dinner. Now, if we use bind on this, we can change the object that this read menu method is trying to use. So let's look at that method real fast. Just remind ourselves it has like this dot appetizer, right? It has references to these different things. So let's change the object that it's trying to use. Let's instead point it. Let's look at our document object, which is built into the browser. And what does our document object have? It's got a lot of stuff, or let me look at it from a different perspective. Document dot. This is sort of a, oh look, here's all this stuff on it. But for example, does it have a, let's try and look here. QRS, like, I don't see a salad on my document or a dessert anywhere, right? So if you try and read a property on an object and it's not there, what do you get back? Undefined, right? So now I'm going to do this. I'm going to dinner dot read menu, but instead of allowing it to be bound to the dinner, I'm going to change the bind and manually tell it you're bound to the document. Oh wait, I need to invoke it after that and then call this. What we get is for an appetizer we have undefined followed by an undefined salad. Our main course is undefined, undefined, and undefined. And that's because when it's calling this function, this no longer refers to our dinner, it now refers to our document. We change the object that our function is referring to at that point in time. That's the typical use of bind. And you can do some really crazy stuff with that. So I could, let's make a different object, and we're going to make a lunch object. And let's say on our lunch, well, we eat a lighter lunch, right? So we'll have a salad. Different salad. I don't eat any of these. Oh, wedge. It's like a wedge, right? Is that a salad? All right. And what else do we have? We have a main course still at lunch. And that's going to be some sort of object, but let's say it's lighter at lunch. And so we have a protein, which is that's everything. Let's just have a really boring. We have a really boring lunch. Black and blue. We'll have a black and blue, right? So now we have a lunch, and maybe we even have a little dessert at lunch. Something smaller though. Right, a piece of chocolate or something, right? Here we've got a lunch object, but it's much more basic than our dinner object was, right? So now, because of the way you can do this bind, and this is really getting into details of JavaScript, it's different. Most languages don't support this type of capability, and it also causes a lot of problems. Our dinner has our read menu method, and we can bind that, and what we're going to do is bind it to our lunch object instead, and then invoke it with our lunch object as the context. What we'll see is for the items that it was able to get a value for, it was able to use those values from the lunch object as opposed to our dinner object. But for everything else, our main course, maybe I spelled protein wrong. Oh, I guess I just made those direct. This dot starch, this dot veggie, this dot protein. Anyways, that's weird. I don't know. My other one must have output wrong as well because my function's wrong. That's why I didn't read that value. But you can. That's not something you do very often. It's very rare for you to be changing your binding. Super rare. But it's important sometimes because, and the reason it exists in JavaScript as a capability is because unlike most other languages, you can sort of lose your binding. So it can accidentally be bound to a different object than you think it is. An example of that, using our same objects that we have here, is let's say I want something just called read menu. And so I'll assign that. I think this will work. Let me check. I'll assign dinner.read menu into that, right? So now I just have a top level read menu variable, and I get nothing. Like it doesn't work because it lost its context. And we can get into the details of why that happens at some point, but it's sort of a nasty aspect of working in JavaScript that you can lose your context of your object. And that's where bind is important. In this case, I could have solved that by changing it so that I said, oh, this is bound to dinner so that it'll have the right context whenever it gets invoked. And now it's going to work. At least as much as it did work before, because this stuff wasn't working.
Did you just change your functions to this dot make or stop?
Yeah, I just need to change my function. I just had my function written wrong. So that's what this is doing right here, like the null bit of this essentially, is it's saying, I don't really care what I'm bound to. I don't care the object that I'm in the context of because this onDelete method isn't going to use anything from that object. It doesn't call this dot anywhere to refer to the object that it's bound to, so it doesn't care, and that's what null is saying. And just bind me to nothing. I don't care. Unimportant, right? The second parameter is the one that's important, but in order to get the second parameter, he had to pass in a parameter for the first value. And so the parameter for the first one is, who cares? That's really what's going on there. Again, like, dig into this a little more, and if somebody wants to come back and tell us what's going on with the binding bit. If not, we'll go into it in a lot more detail in next class. All right, I'm going to fast forward a little bit here. So this was us just passing some properties down into our notes, right? And adding them up at the app level. And you'll notice a practice you'll see a lot is that your methods will have different names, even though, you know, on our note, it's on note, click, on edit, on delete, because that's what you think about when you're working on the note is, oh, I'm editing the note. I click delete. That makes sense in the context of the note. We pass in maybe a different variable or a different name, something that's named different in this context because it makes sense at this context to be different. Maybe it's edit note or delete note, activate note like it has here. So the names can change as you pass them down because in our app, the name needs more context. Down in the note, well, it's just on edit, on delete. It's different levels. Anybody try and parse through what was going on in this like activate note or edit note methods? Because these ones, what? That's where you stop? All right. This is probably, especially if you get rid of the set state bit that's, you know, a little convoluted or whatever, this is right about the level that I would expect most of you to be really challenged by in terms of fully understanding what's going on in it. But with a little bit of time, you could really figure out what this, like this function or this bit here is sort of doing, right? And so these are sort of good functions, good methods to really look at and say, how much of this can I understand completely? And what areas are confusing? Or try and break down and rewrite in a way that makes more sense to you. Because these are smaller, more self-contained, and about the right like sort of scope to try and break down as you're going through stuff. Do you have a question?
I thought of a question for me. Isn't that basically what we just did where it's saying the node ID if the person starts the action, it's saying if it equals the ID, then editing is true, if not return the note where it puts in the new value? Is that what that is?
Yeah, what this is doing, I mean, we talked a little bit about map, right? For example, like squaring or something like that. So what this is doing, and this is where I feel like it's a little easier to whiteboard some of this at times, is, you know, you've got some array of these note objects, and I'm going to be lazy here and just, instead of writing anything out, we'll be like note 1 and note 2, etc. And, you know, a note object has an ID and, what is it, a task. I think that's about all right now, right? And now we're adding, optionally, we're going to add in this editing field. So let's say it also has, what is it called in here? Just editing. And let's say that's just, you know, going to be false by default or whatever for all of them. And for these would be different values. So we've got an array here, dot, of however many notes we have. And when you call map, what it's going to do is invoke that function inside of the map. In this case, this, you know, arrow function for each note, and then return, we're going to get, if this was our starting array, output, we're going to get a new output array. It's going to have a one-to-one mapping from each one of these notes to our new notes. So note 1 prime, right? Note 2 prime, dot, dot, dot. And then if we break that down, right? Okay, it's going to do this for every single note. And for one of these notes, hopefully, the ID of the note is the same as the ID that we're trying to turn on editing for. So that note is going to change. All the other ones, it's basically just going to return the same object and put it in this, right? It'll be like, oh, note 1, yep, it's the same thing, nothing changed. Note 2, no, it's the same thing, nothing changed. But let's say note 4 is the one that we're trying to edit, or the ID that we care about. So that's going to change because for note 4, instead of taking the same values, we're now going to change it to true here. And that's what note 4 will be in our new array.
So it's just picking it at the right ID, for selection or editing, but everything else that is not, matching is going to render the same.
You can think of it as an identity. It's typically called like an identity function if something just returns the same value. So yeah, for all the other ones, it's an identity function. It's just, oh, same thing, same thing, same thing. Oh, I found the one with the right ID. All right, that one I want to change, right? And we're doing that. The reason we have to do that is because we're storing the notes in an array, right? Which is really nice for rendering. It's nice and convenient to render our notes as an array because we just can step over each one of them. But when you do that, how can you find an individual item in an array, right? We've written those functions in our previous JavaScript class where we said like, oh, you know, if you have an array of fruits and you pass in a fruit name, give me the index of that item in the array, right? And tell me what it is. And there's no way for you to find it other than walking through the array to find it, right? So that's what's going on here is it's really just walking through the array to find the one to change and changing that one. If we had stored our data differently, our notes differently, and there's even a note down here that I think is really confusing about it, but I can't remember where it's at here. Oh, here we go. If we used a normalized data structure, I like this other. We used a normalized data structure. It would be possible to write this operation using object.assign or whatever. And so if we had stored our data a little differently, we may not have had to map over all of those items in an array because maybe we don't store them in an array. Maybe we instead have at this top level, instead of this array, we have a notes object. And this notes object, and this, you know, has individual properties for each note, and the key for each property might be the ID of the note. So whatever this is, right? For, in this case, it's actually GUIDs, these long strings, but so we have for, and that's another object, which has the task, you know, learn React, and it has, you know, editing or whatever. And then we have another one, right? 5 or whatever. And this is another object. And so if this was our where our data was stored, if we wanted to say change, we said, oh, we want to turn note 4 on so that we're editing it. How might we do that with something like this?
Wouldn't you do the same as like what we did? You would say this, you would tell it to go to that ID.
So let's even do that. I'm gonna create a notes object. I'm gonna add a couple notes to it. Because these are numbers instead of other stuff. I think I need to use this syntax, the bracket syntax, to refer to it. So notes 5 equals an object, and the task is learn React, and the editing state is false. And notes, I don't know, what's the ID for this one? We'll do 3. The IDs don't have to be sequential or anything. This also equals an object, and our task is clean the dishes. And editing is false. Now if we look at our notes object, we've got a couple different properties on there. So let's say we want to start editing the clean the dishes object. How could we access that and change it?
starting that and then to return a different value?
We can, but we can do it much more easily. How can we, if we want to just, for our dinner that we have, let's say we want to change our dessert. How do I change my dessert for my dinner?
You just type dinner.dessert equals, and you change it to your value.
Right. So let's say I just want to change my task with ID 3 so that it's being edited now on my notes. How do I do that? Right. The only problem is I can't do a .3, and that's just because it would be reserved, so I have to use this syntax or whatever. Notes 3 dot editing equals true. Right. And now that's been changed. But if I was storing these instead as an array, I can't access it that easily. Instead, I have to go over each item in the array to find the one I'm looking for. Right? That's the different ways that you could store your data, and those lead to different models for manipulating that data. Now, you wouldn't, I made this slightly oversimplified because the problem here is we sort of mutated our state, and that can confuse React. But there's still a really simple way to do this. You just have to wrap a function around it. Did you have a question?
It was regarding the, I guess, colons. Are the colons necessary when you're doing, like, I guess, input for, like, arrays and stuff? You know, like the colon 3 colon.
Let me,
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
You mean like this?
No, the, with the 3. Yeah.
Here? You mean do you mean the square brackets?
No, the colons were on the 3rd.
Oh, the commas, or I mean, quotes,
Yeah.
the quotes. I don't know. I did it to be safe. Let's see. No, I didn't need it.
Okay.
Sometimes you do if like, there's reserved words, right? Like break is a reserved word in JavaScript. So I can't just type break, it means something. But I can still, and this is bad, don't do this. But this is not horrible, but if I want to have a property named break, I can do it like this, but I have to use quotes because if I just put break here without it, it tries to interpret it as functional code and is going to fail. That's the only reason I was doing it. It's just a little bit of I've gotten used to burning myself, and so I was protecting myself with the quotes as a extra safeguard. Oh yeah, so I'm gonna, if we have time, although we're getting pretty late already, I'm gonna come back to this. In order to clean up the code, you could extract a method to contain the logic shared by activate note edit and edit note. So if there's a little bit of time, we'll come back to that and try and extract that logic together. But I wanted to make sure I got to what Rondell was talking about here with the uncontrolled component and this input, right? So this got into, we talked a little bit about controlled versus uncontrolled before with React. Last class, it's takes a while to wrap your head around the way that React handles that stuff. But we can, this input and the different properties on it, this we can talk about very easily because this comes out of HTML and just JavaScript. So I'm going to go ahead and add something to my page. It'll only be there temporarily, but we can do sort of this on blur and on key press on our own if we want. So that I'm not working in React, but I'm still in this sort of minimal phase here. I'm going to just add a new element into my body here. How easy is it to add? It is HTML. That should allow me to just add something afterwards. I'm just going to add an input. Let's give it an ID of testing, and let's have some sort of value in there. I think that will work. I'm not certain. I might have to do the value, the actual item or thing, but all right, let's see. So let's see what happens here. All right, I always have this problem. All right, so we added an input here, and this is just straight HTML. We're not using React for this input at all. Oops. Right? And an input element is something that by default you can edit and work with. So this is the equivalent to what React was calling the, oh man, get rid of that if I can. This is the equivalent to what React was calling the uncontrolled, or what our book was calling the uncontrolled component. Because there's nothing here controlling this input or deciding whether or not any values get changed in it, right? The browser does, but I don't have some framework deciding if something's in there. And those sort of attributes, which in React are called properties, right? In HTML, they're called attributes of onBlur and onKeyPress, these events. These are part of the DOM for an input, or really pretty much any element. And we can hook into these events without React as well. So let's get a reference to our testing item. I think this is going to work. We'll see. Oh. I don't think that worked. I'll do it the proper way. Document.getElement by ID. The ID is testing. So now I have a reference to it. And I can add, let's add an onBlur. So let's just have a function that gets called onBlur. And to make it really simple, it will get the event, and it's just going to log it. What blur is, this is a little bit of a confusing term, but it comes from the browser. Basically what it means is when it loses focus, pretty much. So if this guy has focus right now, then everything's good. But when I click somewhere else, something else got focus, and that fired my event handler for the onBlur, because this onBlur fired. So if I, boom, doesn't matter what else gets focus, when this loses it, that's what onBlur is happening on that element. So it fires that event. And we can also hook up to the, what's the other one that we had in here? onKeyPress. So we can do something special on KeyPress as well. In this case, let's start with something simple as well. I think it's key code, maybe. Hope this helps me out. I always forget the exact dot key. Oh, let's try dot key. See if that works. So now we also have an onKeyPress event in here that should log any keys that we press. So if I'm in here, let me go see what's wrong here. Pressed event.key. That should be right. Maybe that's not the proper item, so I'm just going to change this instead. Console.log event. Let's log my event on key presses. Let's see what happens. So it tells me it's a keyboard event, and I can see some information. Alt key, oh, code. Oh, that's right. Okay. No, looks like that should be right. It should have like shown a space or something. So let me go back and see. Try and change it again. Oh, my syntax is wrong here, right? Curly braces. There we go. Now it should log my key presses correctly. So press something, but you don't really get to see it, right? It's just an event that's firing on it, and that's just part of your browser DOM. You can hook up to these events on just about anything. And that's really not React specific. The only React specific bit about it that's different is that they use camel case notation when you're connecting to them, as opposed to in the browser, it uses all sort of lowercase by default or whatever, like you saw me when I was hooking up to them right here on key press. They just use camel case so that it follows the JavaScript convention of camel case and then map that over. But those are essentially hooking right up to events coming straight out of your browser on those items. And you can do sort of whatever you want. In this case, they're going, let's check if the enter button is pressed. And if so, finish our editing. And on blur, finish editing. Now, for somebody who's, I can't speak for other people. For me, there's at least one thing about the way this was written that really drives me batty in terms of communicating what's going on. And that's that on key press, it's calling something called check enter, which by convention in most like programming, it's check enter. I would expect that all that a function called check enter does is it probably just returns true or false on whether or not the enter button was pressed. But instead, it's actually taking some action. So it's a little bit, to me, it's a little misleading, right? Just by the function name. Check enter, all that should be doing is checking if the enter button is pressed, not doing something if it was pressed. You know, if I wanted this to be named better, I might call it like finish editing if enter pressed or something. That's a little verbose and maybe you do it a different way, but it's also more explicit about what's going on. Does that answer your sort of questions, at least about the on blur and the on key press? Yeah, play around with it. Look up, like I've said before, you know, look up the events. Like, check out a keyboard event. What information exists for a keyboard event? What are all the properties? Was the Alt key pressed at the same time? What's the character and the character code? You know, those are older ones. Key code. You know, some of these are old ones. What's the locale? Was a meta key pressed at the time? Is the key being held down so it's repeating automatically? Maybe you don't want it to repeat automatically in your stuff. So if the browser tells you, oh yeah, this is a repeat keyboard press because they just held it down, oh, let's ignore that. We don't want those to register in our code. And you could do, you know, much more complex stuff on key press, right? So let's say, you know, you're being cruel, and so you wrote a very confusing. You decided to write a very, very complicated and confusing program that's not going to be clear at all. And what it's going to do is if event.key equals s, let me make this a little more explicit in terms of my code here. But all right, if they press the S key, and normally you wouldn't refer to yourself this way, but let's just wipe away everything that they were typing. So now it's sort of cruel, like it deleted all my other content because I pressed the S key. You notice something interesting about that is the S is still there afterwards. And that's part of the difference between a controlled and uncontrolled component is you can change what's in there, you can manipulate things, but you're not controlling whether or not those items get written into that HTML element, whether they get put there or not. You can change what's there, but this isn't directly controlling whether or not that event actually puts that in there. Controlled components, they actually decide like, oh, like in a controlled component, you may say, oh, if the key press was S, then just don't register it and don't re-render that, don't add that to my data and re-render. And so that's a little bit of the behavior difference between them. Yeah, so, you know, oh, I just made it really cool. I don't know. I mean. A classic computer prank, if you've never done it, by the way, is to take a screenshot of somebody's Windows desktop and then take all of their icons or whatever and put them in a folder and hide them. And so make that screenshot their wallpaper. So they'll think that, you know, they won't understand why they can't click stuff.
What about deleting or making it look like their computer shutting down?
I mean, you can do stuff like that, yeah. I've done some little pranks when I was in school like that, but those are a little more complex a lot of times.
Oh, that's the one corrupted.
Yeah. All right. So, I mean, did that make some sense? Again, like the difference between controlled and uncontrolled, or at least on blur and on key press? I hope so. All right. Did anybody still need some help? I want to make sure that we have time to help people out before class is done. If anybody needed hands-on help, I don't want to keep going at all. I want to take time for that. Yes, no? People good? Okay. And I don't know if we'll get this done, but let's try and take a few minutes and work through this sort of extra item that he had here. In order to clean up the code, you could extract a method to contain the logic shared by activate, note, edit, and edit note. All right, let's see. Let's just hop over and look at what he's talking about. So we have a couple functions here. Oops. That are very similar in some respect. Activate, note, edit, and edit note. So what's some of the, if you were to look at those, can we try and identify what's maybe shared logic or similar logic between those two? And what's different between them? And you can say anything. You can say the indentation. I don't care.
One is referring to a task and one is referring to, the other one's just editing.
Okay. Yeah.
They're the same all the way up to the point where it talks about note editing, whether it's true or false, and activate note edit is true, and edit note is false, and then it adds on another note task.
All right.
No task is
Yeah. So what you're saying is like only these two lines and this line are different between the two, right? So let's see what we can do about that. I don't know. Let's create a method here. And what am I going to call this? I'm going to call this, I don't know the best way to do this. I'm going to call this find note by ID. And because I'm lazy, and I already know these share the logic that I care about, it's only the middle part that's different. Let's sort of copy some of this logic. Now I've got a problem here. This isn't really just finding a note. It's doing more than that, right? It's mapping and creating a new array of stuff. So maybe I named this wrong. And this is what I do when I'm doing development. I mean, I just started with some sort of name that I thought made sense. So change note, maybe. Because that's sort of, both of these are changing the note in some way. And so what I did here was I got rid of this logic. Because the only thing that differs is how we're changing the note, what change we're making to our note, right? So far, I mean, pretty much the same. So now, let's assume we're going to keep an activate note edit and an edit note. We've got a problem here right now of like, how are we going to change our note or whatever, or how are we going to share this code between these two? And there's a lot of different ways to tackle this. So I'll be really interested if anybody has an idea of a different way to tackle some of this, or even if RS would have tackled this in a different approach. But let's say now, okay, well, our activate note edits, we want it to be the same. We don't want to change any of the code farther down. But this guy can rely on this dot change note, change the note. But we need to do at least one other thing here. I'm going to need to bind these now. I'm pretty sure I will. Could be wrong, but I think I'll need to. All right. So we've got. Let me bring my old code. Oops. With these items up here, I'm going to lose this first. Let me save that real fast. This is just so I don't have to retype this stuff. Get back out of change note and just get what we had before. So I'm going to leave this around for now, but I'm going to comment it out because I know I want to keep this logic here. And then this dot change note. I know I want to change a specific note that got passed in, but I also want to specify like how to change my note somehow. So this is a little tricky because you probably haven't written something exactly like this, but are there any ideas on how we can compose this or how we can do something here? So I'm gonna try and make it a little easier to think about this. What if we in here create a function? I'm going to call it set editing on note. It takes a note and we want it to return so we want this to return our note, but now with the editing value set to true. So how could we write a function that would take a note object and it's going to return that same object, but the editing value is set to true now?
You're just gonna use the same code,
Yeah.
do an if else statement. Or you're gonna say node ID equals ID.
Well, let's presume in this case that, sorry, that may have been a little confusing. Let's presume that this is only going to get called on a note that we know we want to, we already know we want to set this one to editing equals true.
Okay.
So we're passing in only the correct note, right? So assuming we just got an object, all we want to do here is change the,
You're just gonna change the property like we do on anything else, right?
change the property like we do anything else, maybe even return that so that we can always treat it like it's something that we return. So we can do note dot editing equals true, and then like return note. There's a lot of different ways to do this. This isn't ideal. I'm just sort of throwing something together here. So we have here a function now that if given the correct note returns that same note object, but with the editing value set to true. That's really what we were doing here, right? That's what I said with the array is we're only changing one item. Everything else is sort of an identity. So if we have this function that could accomplish that, and we already have another method here, whatever, that iterates over all of our notes and can find one because it takes an ID, is there any way we could combine that or use that? Maybe we need to change our change note method. Maybe it needs different parameters or something, I don't know. So what if we go back and look at this map, right? What does this map function take as its parameter? Not actually, it takes a function. And it runs that function on each note, right? Now what if in this case, we pass our function in to our change note as well? So this guy needs to take some sort of function. In this case, let's call it we'll expect it to be like transform the matching note. So if we have the right note, transform it in some way, right? Whatever that is. Change, we can call it change, so I match there. So here, now we could, this is, yeah, I'm gonna have to change this a little bit. I've got a problem here. Because here I just return note. It's a little convoluted. There's probably a better way to have done this. I'm going to call change matching note with the note. I think this is going to work, although it's a little convoluted. because like I said, I'm returning the note here, although you sort of don't need to because they're all referring to the same object, which is why I'm not using the value here. Let's see if that works. I don't know. I don't think so already because I missed my line up here. I think I need that. All right. Am I compiling at least? Okay, compiled. I'm gonna re-render. Oh, looks like it's still working. So is that, I mean, for the most part, does that make sense? We've got this common code change note, and what it's doing is finding our note to change, but it's just invoking whatever function we passed in to actually make the change. So if we've done that to one of these, did it for activate note edit, how could we change edit notes to do sort of the same thing? And don't try and think about stuff from scratch. Use the other code that you already have a pattern for when you have it. So when it's some sort of, let me comment all this out because we're not going to want the old stuff, right?
Use the same set heading on the, or use like a function.
We can call it whatever we want. We could call this one if we want, right? If we think that you want to call it something that makes the most sense. This takes a note, and it's going to do the same thing, although I'm not even going to return the note from this one because that was a little misleading just because of the way this works. This, in some respect, this isn't the best way to build this, and I wish I had thought through this ahead of time to make it a little cleaner, but you could do note dot, in this case, note dot editing equals false because we're done editing it, right? And then, what's the other line there? Equals our task. But you guys are, now we're going to notice a problem here. And so this is where we've got a little bit of an, oh no, actually I guess it's not because our task is up here. We're fine. And this is sort of interesting because we're using the closure. So if we have our function now, what's our next bit? What? We don't, yeah, you don't have to in this case, and I can talk about that later. Like, I don't even think you needed to there. Right. So this dot change note, just like before, right? And once again, with an ID and set note task is the function we want to pass in. That'll get called. So now let's see if we're working. Refresh everything. We're going to test this out. Learn React components. I don't know. Looks like it's working. And now most of that code, the set state logic, the iterating over the notes, everything else, all of that is shared. And this edit note and activate note edit only have the bit of code that they sort of care about in them. So it lets you, right? All we did there was pull out some code that was common and reuse it. Now there's some bits about this that are suboptimal. We could revisit that in the future. Because it's not ideal for a function to, like I said, we didn't need the return. It's not ideal for a function to manipulate the object that gets passed into it and expect the function outside of it to be working with that same object. It's better to pass something back so that you don't have that sort of binding between things, but it's perfectly fine for a first pass when you're trying to work through something. Oh, we're trying to refactor this. Let's clean it up a little bit and do it this way. Yeah. I don't know. Is that useful to work through, pulling that code out, the shared code? I think if we look at even delete note, nope, that one's very different. See, I couldn't remember. That one's very different, but you know, it could possibly have been similar. So that's a common thing to do when you're coding, is to look for these patterns. This, oh, I see a lot of code that's similar here in these 3 different functions. How can I pull that shared bit out and reuse it if it makes sense? So that I don't have to write that over and over again, so that if that same logic needs to change, then I change it in one place as opposed to 4 places, etc. All right. I think that's